First, I would like to congratulate the Slobodan Milosevic International Committee for conducting this conference. The imperialist countries depend on their enormous propaganda machine to justify their criminal actions. They rewrite historical truth and disguise their crimes with lies. One of their greatest weapons is their attempt to demonize those popular leaders who attempt to defend the historic victories of the oppressed peoples and nations. A review of the attempt to demonize Slobodan Milosevic illuminates this tactic by the oppressor class to attempt to weaken and divide the resistance against its rule. Thus, a defense of the contributions of President Milosevic is a defense of the right of oppressed peoples to fight for sovereignty of their nations and freedom from exploitation of their labor and the theft of their natural resources of the land they inhabit. This conference provides an opportunity to expose the reactionary and predatory role of the NATO military alliance under US leadership. NATO countries continue their attempt to expand the hegemony of the Western imperialists and to reverse the struggles for national liberation that were won during the existence of the socialist Soviet Union. Your conference will expose the 10-year aggressive war the NATO imperialists waged against the multinational Yugoslav state. I'm sure the contributors from the Serbian and other peoples of Yugoslavia will provide the details of the crimes committed against them. From the center of world imperialism in the United States, we want to support your condemnation of these crimes and to honor Milosevic for his contribution to historic truth. He did this during his heroic defense of Yugoslavia and condemnation of NATO, made while defending himself at the Kangaroo Court in The Hague. When NATO was established in 1949 under US domination, it was falsely presented as defense against the socialist Soviet Union. From that time until 1990, however, the NATO forces' main use was to prevent social revolutions in Western and Southern Europe. It repressed social movements, specifically in Greece, imposing a military dictatorship from 1967 to 74, threatened intervention in Portugal in 1974-75, and prevented social changes in Italy. After the disappearance of the Warsaw Pact in 1991, NATO exposed its predatory role, going on the offensive. In the 1990s, the NATO powers, with German and US imperialism in the lead, were taking every step to weaken and destroy Yugoslavia. From the start, Berlin aided reactionary separatist forces in each republic of the multinational Socialist Federation of Yugoslavia. To regain hegemony over Berlin and the other NATO powers, Washington pushed the conflict toward open war, where the Pentagon's preeminent place in destructive power would predominate. US President Bill Clinton stepped up the drive toward war. Together with Germany and France, and using air bases in Italy, the US began bombing and firing missiles at mainly civilian targets in Serbia on March 24, 1999. The bombing lasted for 78 days and killed 3,000 people. Bridges, schools, and hospitals were hit, along with the Chinese embassy in Belgrade and Yugoslav television and radio stations. Many of the residents of Serbia and Montenegro, whether Serbs, Roma, Jews, or other Yugoslav peoples, showed their heroism during the 78 days of open war. They walked in open spaces and defiantly defended bridges, wearing T-shirts with targets on them. Those in the military were ready to fight and camouflaged their equipment so well that the bombing destroyed few tanks. Parents send their children to grandparents in the villages while carrying out their work in the major cities. Yugoslavs should know that these actions were an inspiration to anti-imperialists in the United States, who were encouraged by the people's heroic actions in defense of their land and their social rights. Since NATO's intervention against Yugoslavia, the United States has turned the alliance into a type of imperialist police force. No longer confined to Europe, NATO has become a worldwide intervention force at the service of the transnational monopolies that exploit global labor and resources. The US has used NATO in its occupations of Iraq and especially Afghanistan, made war against Libya and Syria, and has threatened intervention in Belarus and Ukraine. even threatening Russia this year with war exercises marching toward Russian borders. The US and NATO powers succeeded with guns and money in breaking up the Socialist Federation of Yugoslavia. They succeeded in overthrowing the last independent government in Eastern Europe, the one in Belgrade. To add to the crimes of the imperialist powers in the Balkans, they blamed the victims of the aggressive war. The NATO powers used the United Nations to set up the International Criminal Tribunal on Yugoslavia as a political instrument to punish anyone in the Balkans who resisted the imperialist takeover of the region. It brought charges against Milosevic right in the midst of the US NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in May of 1999, obviously to bring additional pressure on the Yugoslav leadership. The imperialists have the advantage of owning the most powerful propaganda machine in world history. But the criminal court failed miserably when it tried to prove to the world that Slobodan Milosevic was guilty of any of the crimes committed against the people of the Balkans in the 1990s. This propaganda offensive obscured the interference, subversion, and divide and conquer tactics practiced by German and US imperialism, most of all in connivance with the neo-fascist groupings of the republics of Croatia and Bosnia and in Serbia's Kosovo province. From the day he was kidnapped from a Belgrade prison to Scheveningen in The Hague and placed under NATO imprisonment, Milosevic carried out, under horribly unequal conditions, a heroic legal and political battle against the people who ordered him there. Like his fellow Balkans political prisoner of the 1930s, Bulgarian communist Georgi Dimitrov, who successfully defended himself against bogus Nazi charges that he burned the Reichstag, Milosevic waged his own legal defense in the bogus NATO court. Ill much of the time, Milosevic worked with the aid of a handful of supporters and little money before hostile judges who make up the rules as they go along. He still demolished the prosecution by exposing witnesses as stool pigeons and war criminals trading lies for immunity. We were proud to learn that Milosevic used the book the International Action Center published as a keystone of his defense. Ramsey Clark, the leader of the IAC, made a key contribution to this book. The NATO court spent tens of millions of dollars, prepared for a year, put on 295 prosecuting witnesses over 2 years, and proved nothing. On the contrary, Milosevic turned the tables on the 500,000 pages of so-called evidence against him and showed that Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, Gerhard Schröder, General Wesley Clark, and the rest of the NATO heads of state and government and their generals were the real butchers of the Balkans and the ones who deserved to be on trial for war crimes. The best concise summary of this argument is given in Milosevic's own 2004 opening defense talk, which we published the English version of in The Defense Speak, The History and the Future. That's Ramsey Clark's organization, the International Action Center. We want to thank Slobodan Milosevic for this contribution to the world's struggle for liberation. And we say now with the rest of you there, Smirt NATO, Živa Yugoslavia!